But I think the basic question, and the question that I always like to ask is, after all, what is the definition of pro-Israel? Because after all, the phrases pro-Israel and anti-Israel are thrown around an awful lot in our community and in Congress. But what do they really mean? And how has this definition evolved? So let me give you a little bit, if I might, a little historical perspective from where I'm coming from. I first started working in Washington 20 years ago. And then pro-Israel in Congress meant three things. It meant being for Israel aid, which is still somewhat relevant today. It was being against any arms sales to any Arab country, which is not particularly relevant anymore. And most significantly, pro-Israel meant anti-Palestinian. Because then, in Congress, what was good for the Palestinians was ipso facto bad for Israel. It was, after all, at that time, illegal under the law for members of Congress to talk to members of the PLO. No member of Congress, hardly any member of Congress, ever met with any Palestinian leader at all. Either a Palestinian leader from Palestine or an American Palestinian leader. Frankly, very few members of Congress met with the groups that preceded you. Peace Now, New Jewish Agenda, those groups were not welcome in the halls of Congress for any member that remotely considered themselves a pro-Israel member. The definition of Palestinians, they were two things. They were refugees and terrorists. And no credible political figure in the American spectrum, particularly in Congress, ever talked about a Palestinian state. It was essentially a zero-sum game. It was a zero-sum game. Now, fortunately, that definition is changing and has changed for many members of Congress. And particularly after these 4 years or 4+ years of intifada, for people like my boss, for people like me, the definition of pro-Israel has come to mean something else, which is rejecting the status quo. Because after all, how can you consider yourself pro-Israel and accept a status quo that has left 1,000 Israelis dead and 3,000 Palestinians dead, that has left a collapsed Israeli economy, that has left a collapsed Israeli tourism industry? How could you consider yourself pro-Israel and essentially watch as the Zionist dream will come to an end? Because after all, if we don't achieve a viable two-state solution, in a few years, Arabs will outnumber Jews between the Mediterranean and the Jordan, meaning that Israel will either no longer be a democracy or no longer be a Jewish state. So how can you be pro-Israel and accept that outcome? And forget about being pro-Israel. What about being pro-American? At a time when the United States has 140,000 troops on the ground, occupying a huge Arab country, trying to pacify an insurgency, isn't it clearly in our U.S. national interest to work as hard as we can to try to tamp down and end the violence between Israelis and Palestinians, which is such a recruiting tool for terrorists and such an inflammatory point, there and around the Arab world. So these are the questions that members of Congress must be asked. Members of Congress must be told that if you're pro-Israel, you have to know that the only hope for Israel's future safety and security is a comprehensive political agreement that includes a viable Palestinian state, and the only way that's going to be achieved is through forceful, hands-on U.S. diplomatic efforts that require both sides to fulfill their commitments. And this message has to come from you. It has to come from Jews. It has to come first and foremost from American Jews. Because when it comes to Israel issues, members of Congress take most of their cues from the American Jewish community.